You're not a product manager, you're a waiter or waitress for features. You take orders, bring them to the kitchen, deliver on time, smile, and ask if everything's okay. We need customizable reports. You write it down and go develop it. We need urgent integration with SAP. Write it down. Real-time dashboard, write it down. Advanced filters, write it down. In other words, your roadmap has become a menu and you've become a server. Everyone makes requests, you deliver, no one is satisfied, and you don't understand why. Because deep down, you've turned your product area into a feature factory, a factory of purposeless features with no strategy and no real value. And worst of all, you've become the head of production for this factory. So I'm going to tell the story of a PM I met at an industry event, a women-only event, and she shared the following story with a group of people who were chatting during the break. I found it super interesting, and it really matched with what we're talking about here. It was a SaaS product for HR, and I'm going to kind of mix in her words here, okay? She said it was an endless backlog. They needed customizable fields, they delivered. Missing export to PDF, they delivered. Where's the pie chart? They delivered. Slack integration, and so on. And then, according to her, in 18 months, 47 new features had been released. The team was exhausted. The product was complex, especially to maintain a product of that magnitude. The users were satisfied, right? Good metrics, low churn, success stories, right? A success story, right? Until a new client canceled in the first week and left with devastating feedback, right? She mentioned that people were in shock, Oh, the product does everything, but it doesn't solve any specific problem very well. According to her, that's when the penny dropped, right? That they were delivering wishes, not solving pains. The product became a digital Swiss Army knife. It has everything, but it's not excellent at anything. And worse, they found out that after a deeper analysis, they discovered that 70% of the features were used by less than 10% of the user base. Just imagine 70% of the features used by less than 10% of the user base. In other words, they built a monster of complexity to satisfy vocal minorities, you could say. So the complete product, according to what she mentioned, was actually inferior to the first MVP from 2 years earlier. The takeaway is more features, less focus, more options, less clarity, more functionalities, less value. So Feature Factory is truly a silent epidemic in the product world, especially, and this is quite often the case, when the product team still doesn't quite have the ideal level of maturity or the necessary experience to effectively go against this pervasive and often overwhelming Feature Factory trend. So let's understand how we end up in this trap, because it really is a trap for product professionals, and not just for them, but for the entire company. The first symptom is that you measure success by output, not by outcome. So how many features did you deliver this quarter? How many story points did you close? These are factory metrics, not product metrics. Because a factory thinks in terms of volume, while product thinks in terms of impact. Second symptom, confusing demand with need. So someone asks for a feature and you deliver it, but you never ask, why do you need this? A simple question. Why do you need this? Sometimes it's just a workaround for a problem you should be solving at the root, but instead you just address a quick fix and don't actually solve the underlying issue. The third symptom, the roadmap turns into a Tetris of requests. So sales asks for an integration, customer support asks for a dashboard, marketing asks for analytics, and you try to fit everything in like it's a puzzle. The result is a product that lacks coherence. So the fourth symptom, and this is where the real poison lies, so to speak, Feature Factory is the result of a PM without product vision, without the ideal level of maturity, right? Of just handling requests without building trust. So when you don't know where you're headed, any feature seems to make sense, Besides the lack of vision or the short-sightedness regarding the product you're building, right? You also lack maturity. So you kind of just let life take you wherever it goes. You just keep jotting down requests and passing them on to the team to execute. So you actually become a hostage to these requests because you don't have your own criteria to say no. And then we get to the fifth symptom, which is that stakeholders learn that you're a vending machine. It might sound harsh to say this, but that's really what happens. They learn that. So they start submitting requests and get features in return. They submit another request and receive the feature they asked for. So the whole process becomes addictive for everyone. They stop thinking about problems and you stop thinking about solutions. You don't ask the right questions, you don't say no properly, you don't say no at the right time. In other words, I repeat, they stop thinking about problems and you stop thinking about solutions. And finally, the feature factory is the illusion of productivity because you keep the team busy, the sprints full, the velocity high, and it seems like everything is working until you realize that what you're building is a house of cards, complex on the outside, fragile, delicate, but empty on the inside. So how do we manage to get out of the feature factory and go back to being a product manager? Some painful suggestions, but I think they're absolutely necessary. The first one is to stop accepting requests, unreasonable demands. Accept problems. So when someone asks for a feature, ask what problem it solves. If you can't do anything else, at least ask that question. So if they can't articulate the problem, the request has to go back to the end of the line. If the request of the stakeholder can't articulate what problem it solves, would solve, or what the pain is, where it hurts, the request goes back to the end of the line. It doesn't make sense. The second suggestion is audit your backlog now. How many items are solutions without a clear problem? How many are requests you wrote down automatically? And then delete 50%. It hurts, but it's liberating. I'm sure that at the very least it's liberating and will help you clean up your backlog, which will really help you bring more purpose and impact to your product, okay? The third suggestion is set a strategic theme for each quarter, okay? It's just a suggestion. So in Q1, it's about onboarding. Every request that doesn't improve onboarding gets pushed to quarter 2, let's say. This is usually very closely tied to when companies work with OKRs. This works really well. So it's an interesting suggestion because then the focus, because in this case, focus forces choices and choices bring clarity. That's fundamental. The fourth suggestion is shift from delivery strategies to outcome metrics. So instead of delivering 12 features, we reduce time to value by 40%. In other words, actually measure impact. The fifth suggestion is to create a discontinuation practice. Of course, if that makes sense for your context, okay? But the idea here is for every new feature, identify an old one that you can kill. How are you going to identify the criteria? You'll decide that according to your context. Oh, no one is using it. It hasn't been used for I don't know how many X amount of time. So anyway, it's causing a lot of problems in production. Anyway, folks, I think it's worth in this suggestion for you to understand what criteria support this discontinuation strategy for each new feature that comes in, right? It's that old story. For every piece of clothing you buy, you take some out of your closet and donate them, right? And you keep making this healthy exchange. That's basically the concept. Because at the end of the day, the product isn't just about adding, it's about editing too, right? Curation here is more important than creation itself. The sixth suggestion here is learn to say no with purpose. So we're not going to do this because it doesn't align with our vision of solving X for Y. I think that when you learn to say no backed by a reason for being, it's not stubbornness, it's strategy. So I think this perspective is very important to start breaking down this feature factory culture. So the last suggestion is to question whether you're building a product or a platform, because a product solves a specific problem very well, and a platform allows you to solve several problems reasonably well. So two completely different strategies. You need to have this clarity in order to walk down the right path. So I ask you something quite simple and straightforward. If you were to remove a significant 70% of your product's current features today, would it still effectively solve your valued user's primary and most important problem? Because the idea here is that if the product's core is truly strong enough, even without most of the additional add-ons, it still fulfills its essential primary function, like WhatsApp, for example. WhatsApp could lose stickers, those animated images, status updates, and some other features. But if it kept sending messages quickly and reliably, it would still solve the main problem it sets out to address. Because at the end of the day, folks, users don't fall in love with features, right? They fall in love with the problems you solve in a simple and efficient way. So I think it's really important to consider whether we're creating a product that's centered on a real problem and solving it well. Or if we're falling into the illusion that more features equals more value. I think that's a really interesting point to think about, to reflect on, to observe in your daily life and consider. And so, in the end, I think the final message, a bit provocative, a bit cliche, let's say, but still valid, is stop being a waiter or waitress and go back to being the master chef of your product so you can gradually reduce this feature factory culture that pleases some but displeases others. And in the end, it's bad for everyone. All right? I think that's it for today. See you in the next episode. Bye bye.